Welcome back to the Sitrep podcast, everybody, your forward operations base for historical military wargaming. I'm your host, Ariskin Jim, and today we are back for part 2 of our West Bank at the Suez Canal game set in the Yom Kippur War of 1973 using the 7 Days to the River Rhine game system by Great Escape Games. Now in part 1 of this video, link is in the description below, we went over all the background for the 1973 Yom Kippur War, especially in the south, in the Sinai Desert, where the Egyptian army started off with a kind of a masterpiece assault across the Suez Canal and into the Israeli-occupied Sinai. We talked about all the Israeli setbacks that they suffered in the early phases of this war and how the Israelis finally managed to turn the tide and launch what history would call Operation Abiri Halev, or Stout-Hearted Men, sometimes called Operation Gazelle. This was the Israeli counteroffensive back across the Suez Canal, and once they managed to get their bridgehead properly lodged, they started this great pivot to the south, spearheaded by 2 divisions, the ultimate objective of which was to reach Port Suez at the extreme southern tip of the Suez Canal. If the Israelis could reach and take Port Suez in sufficient strength, this maneuver allows them to completely cut off and isolate the entire Egyptian Third Army. That's about half of the Egyptian forces that they've managed to push into the Sinai so far. Now, to prevent the Israelis from completing this maneuver, the Egyptians are naturally mobilizing all kinds of big units out of their strategic reserve, and these units are moving forward out of the west to hit the Israelis in their right flank as they're driving south again towards Port Suez. This is the battle that we have seen on our table. Again, we're using the 7 Days to the River Rhine game system. Specifically, we're looking at the 113th Mechanized Brigade of the Egyptian 6th Mechanized Division and elements of the 3rd Armored Brigade of the Egyptian 4th Armored Division. Their mission is to outflank and cut off lead elements of this big Israeli push to the south. On our table, we're talking about the 460th Armored Brigade under Colonel Gabi Amir and the 890th Paratrooper Battalion. This is all part of Bren Adan's 162nd Division. So in summary, as the Israelis are moving south to cut off the Egyptians, they are being attacked out of the west by Egyptians trying to cut them off in turn. We've had tanks exchanging long-range fire. We had an attempted Israeli airstrike that didn't really go so well. And we've had a lot more combat much closer in, because the terrain here on the west bank of the Suez Canal is a lot closer than a lot of people might imagine. People tend to think of the Arab-Israeli wars and they picture these vast rolling deserts of open dunes, but that definitely applies to a lot of the Arab-Israeli conflicts. But here at the Yom Kippur War, once you get onto the west bank of the Suez Canal, the terrain gets much more dense. We're talking about all kinds of agricultural projects. That means freshwater irrigation canals, buildings, urban development, roads, bridges. We're talking about pump houses and generators, all these very short lines of sight that cause a lot of problems. Now, a quick note before we get started, for people who like to play 7 Days to the River Rhine, I am not using the tactical advantage cards in this scenario. Tactical advantage cards are great for the original purpose of 7 Days to the River Rhine, which of course is a hypothetical war that never actually happened. Here in a strict historical setting, we do know who had air superiority, who had artillery superiority, who had what support assets, and things like that. So what I've done is I've taken the tactical advantage cards out of the game, at least the random draw elements, and I've worked up 1973 specific historical options and built them into both sides' order of battle. Specifically in this game, I'm talking about Israeli airstrikes and Egyptian artillery. I wanted to mention that real quick up front because as we get into the video, we get into some Egyptian artillery strikes right off the bat. So enough of all that, let's go ahead and go to the footage and see what this Egyptian artillery can get done. Now into turn 3, and the Egyptians are the active player. You see here one of their T-55 tank platoon commanders, the officer is standing tall in his turret there, has spent his first activation, as indicated by the green poker chip he's standing on, to move onto the bridge. The Egyptian player then spends a second activation for that same unit to take another action. He makes the roll accordingly to call in an artillery mission on that battalion of 890th Paratrooper Battalion hiding out in that concrete building. So this is going to be a whole swarm of shells fired by a battery of off-board D-30 122mm howitzers. The first thing the Egyptian player has to do is, number 1, designate his aiming point, then roll to hit that aiming point, and then we roll to see what gets hit within the area of effect. Believe it or not, the infantry is okay, but apparently enough shrapnel has been thrown around to disable both of those M113 APCs. Here along the southern part of the battlefield, Mark is moving forward with some of his favorite units. These are his Stalin 3 heavy tanks. So he moves forward with his first activation, but he can't shoot because those Stalins are indicated in special rules as lumbering units. They cannot move and shoot in the same activation like most battle tanks can. So he has to spend a second activation, make the according die roll. Turns out, however, he doesn't even want to shoot with that Stalin, at least not directly. That Stalin happens to have an officer in it, so he's going to use it to call in an artillery mission. Now, the Egyptians only have so many of these artillery missions. However, he did well enough with the first one that they're going to see how far they can push their luck. So he designates his aiming point. It's that squad of infantry right there. Ooh, he might actually be close enough to hit some of his own guys. Those Egyptian infantry are danger close. Turns out they are just outside the blast radius of his own artillery. Mark tells me he doesn't care either way. Those infantry are expendable to him. Alright, so we see where the aiming point is. We roll to hit each enemy unit, or even friendly unit really, that happens to be within the area of effect. It's a 6 inch radius, and the Egyptian dice are suddenly on fire. They need a 6 up to hit each individual unit that we see on our screen there. They hit every single one. So it's 1 out of 2, 1 out of 4, 1 out of 8 to score 3 consecutive hits when the chance to hit is 6+ on a D10. And then we start rolling effects. So if you're familiar with 7 Days to the River Rhine, for infantry you have to roll a certain number of dice, and then if you score hits on them, you can convert them into additional morale tokens. So we see those white poker checks getting put next to the infantry. Those are incremental damage done to infantry. It's actually pretty hard to just straight out kill infantry in this game. You pretty much have to pin them to death, to put it simply. And now we have to see what else is going on here. Okay, so that M113 took a direct hit, and then it exploded. It didn't just die, it exploded. So that affects the infantry again. Any friendly infantry within 4 inches of an exploding friendly vehicle takes another morale token. And then again, the Egyptian dice, man, I think they roll like a 9 on this D10. Something hit either the engine deck or the roof or the turret of that Magak right there. And yeah, that's another Israeli tank knocked out by Egyptian artillery. The Israeli Magak 3 battle tank you see there at the extreme upper right of your screen just took a shot at that T-55 you see there at upper left and missed with a bad die roll. Now the T-55 is going to take a second activation and shoot back. Notice the second green poker check underneath his vehicle there. It's a pretty tough roll for the Egyptians. They start off with a 6+, make that a 7+ because the Israeli tank was moving, make it an 8+ because of intervening terrain. But with a 10, Ron scores a hit. So apparently it's opposite day. The Israelis can't shoot straight and the Egyptians are dead-eyeing everything. However, the Israelis catch a break and the Egyptian shell does not penetrate the Israeli tank's frontal armor. Another one of Mark's Stalin 3s has lumbered around the Israeli southern wing and is now engaging Israeli reinforcements as they come onto the table. So notice these tanks look a little different. These are Magak 2s with smaller 90mm guns. So the Israeli term Magak, this is basically their name for imported American-made M48 battle tanks, later M60 battle tanks. To put it simply, the Magak 2 is the American M48A2, and the Magak 3 is the M48A5 with the larger British-made 105mm rifle. The Egyptians continue to press their advantage, moving forward with more of their T-55 battle tanks and trying to get them to engagement range with some of this Israeli armor. Now, as they're moving forward like this, some of the Israeli Magak 3 battle tanks that you can't quite see in frame here do see the move and try to preempt with some reaction fire. Unfortunately, the Israelis whiff that roll. That still costs them an order activation, by the way, and the Egyptians get their shot. They need an 8+, even with a difficult roll, 8+ on a D10. They score with a 9. So apparently the Egyptian gunners have just had their coffee this morning, even the tough shots they're making. Meanwhile, the Israelis are missing pretty much everything. So now that they've hit, you have to penetrate the Israeli armor. You have to roll a D10, you add it to your gun's anti-tank value, and you have to beat the Israelis' frontal armor roll, which is a 13. So long story short, take your first shot. The Egyptians have to beat a 5 on a D10. They roll a natural 10, and there goes another Magak. Now into turn 4, and the Israelis still cannot catch a break. As more and more of this Egyptian armor pushes forward into the center of the table, some of it comes within range of where that squad of 890th Paratrooper Battalion was with bazooka anti-tank rockets. Yes, literal bazookas from World War I, but they fail to activate, and so nothing much happens. Where the Israelis do make their activation checks, however, against all odds, look at all those morale tokens and previous activation tokens. Nevertheless, they still managed to go ahead and activate enough to pull out of that building, which is a good thing. They were catching way too much fire. So, kind of stymied for now, the Israelis pass over initiative to the Egyptians, who designate that that officer is going to go ahead and call in the third and last 122 millimeter offboard artillery barrage for the Egyptians. They are designating their target. It's going to be that Magak 3, just barely coming over the hill there. They do have a line of sight on that aim point. So, yeah, they're going to go ahead and designate as their aim point and then roll to hit that aim point. They do succeed. Again, when do they miss with their artillery? Egyptian artillery was very, very potent in 1973. I don't know if it was this potent. Two things are actually at play here, to be perfectly honest. Long story short, take your second shot. The Egyptians are rolling like absolute fiends here. And number two, these are my house rules that I'm rolling out for the first time. I think Egyptian artillery, and to be fair, Israeli air power is a little overpowered. We're going to come back to that a little bit later in the video. But we've designated that as the aim point. It's a 6-inch radius. You see where both of those other Magaks are barely in range. We're going to go ahead and say that the Egyptians get one of them because we don't want to be cheesy. We let the Egyptians pick. They're going to pick that forward one. So those two Magaks there in center frame are the two that are going to be potentially hit by the Egyptian artillery. Now, number one, he's got to roll to actually hit his aiming point, and then that aiming point is going to be the center of their area of effect. Anything in the area of effect then has to be hit again on a little bit of a tougher roll. But who am I kidding? These are the Egyptians we're talking about. Long story short, take your third shot. They're going to start making hits and penetrating roof armor of Magak tanks. The Israelis just can't seem to buy a break today. Mark continues to push around the south wing with his beloved Stalin 3s. He loves these things. Unfortunately, they can't move and shoot in the same activation. They have that lumbering special rule, so he has to spend a second activation and make the roll accordingly. So the Stalins have taken all of their shots, but missed. For once, the Israelis caught a break. Meanwhile, the Egyptians are really pushing into the middle of the board. You see here where their infantry has occupied these central buildings and used the elevation to engage the remnants of those Israeli paratroopers up there. The Egyptians are under pretty intense counterfire, though, from these two M113 APCs. We're talking about all kinds of 30 caliber, 50 caliber fire, and multiple morale tokens are now put on those Egyptian infantry teams. Meanwhile, two squads of Israeli paratroopers have moved through that brush and straight out annihilated two squads of Egyptian infantry, complete with RPGs that were giving Jennifer such a tough time before. Meanwhile, these Stalins, man, I mean, it took them an extra turn to move in position because they can't move and shoot in the same activation. Again, that lumbering special rule. And now they're in position, they just can't hit anything. Or even when they do, they're not penetrating, even with their larger 122 millimeter guns, they're not penetrating Israeli armor. The Israelis are actually starting to catch a little bit of a break here. So you see on those Israeli Magaks, multiple white morale tokens. They have been damaged, but just not knocked out yet. Surveying the battlefield, the Israelis are thinking, maybe we should, bring in our last two airstrikes. The problem is here with their officers and their scouts, where they are and how many are left. So we're taking a quick survey here to see what options they have to bring in their airstrikes. Eligible units to call them in are either too far back or already knocked out or blinded by terrain. Believe it or not, the Israelis are surprisingly tactically blind when it comes to calling in their airstrikes, at least at the moment. By this point, the Egyptians are turning the northern Israeli wing as well. So notice that T-55 doing its flanking maneuver there is being very careful to stay out of line of sight of that tow-armed Jeep, leaving us with the unluckiest paratrooper squad in the Israeli Defense Force. I mean, these poor guys. They've been hit by artillery, In past turns, they're now under fire from perhaps 2 T-55s, although honestly that T-55 over there to the left may be blocked by the burning Magog. But they're definitely under fire from that Egyptian infantry team, damaged as they are, stationed there in that tall building. So as we continue to stack more and more of those white morale tokens, those indicate incremental damage inflicted on the Israeli paratroopers, it becomes a question of how much they can take. However, this scenario does consider them elite troops. They have a morale of 6, which is very, very high. And the only way to eliminate infantry in 7 days to the River Rhine is to exhaust their morale tokens. So, elite troops, you really have to pile on a lot of damage. I'll be honest, lesser infantry would have broken by now. When the end does come, though, it does come swiftly and mercifully. So that T-55 that I wasn't sure if it had a line of sight before because of the burning Israeli armor, the Egyptian players have now spent another activation, moved that tank forward, and are now putting more 100mm HE frag into that squad and 12.7mm Dushka fire. You do a couple more morale tokens, and that finally tips it over the edge, and at long last that heroic squad is taken out. Here at the end of turn 5, we have reached something of an interesting juncture in the game. It's kind of clear that the Israelis may have lost the day, however they don't want to quit yet, because at the end of turn 5, the Egyptians have, believe it or not, used up all of their activations for the turn, which means that their Shilka air defense systems, their ZSU-23-4s, will not be able to protect against incoming Israeli airstrikes. That's right, the Israelis still have 2 A4 Skyhawks they can bring in. Again, everyone, we're not using the tactical advantage cards provided in 7 Days to the River Rhine. We have historical 1973 specific airstrike options that the Israeli Air Force was using in this conflict. Jennifer has selected to engage these 2 Stalin 3s. Therefore, she's using Rockeye cluster munitions. She has to roll to establish an aim point. She did that. That aim point then is the center of an area of effect radius. We roll to hit everything in that radius. She just rolled a 5 and a 9. She's actually rolling well for a change. So she's now hit both of those tanks with her Rockeye cluster munitions. These are top-down attack munitions, kind of designed to attack armor. Nevertheless, I think they're a little overpowered. These are house rules by myself, and my first time rolling them out, I think they're a little OP. It doesn't really matter if the Stalins explode, they're both toast. Let's just leave it at that. Here comes the last Israeli airstrike, third and final airstrike. Again, it's the end of the turn, and the Egyptians have used up all of their order activations, so there's not going to be any air defense fire from those Shilkas. It just remains for Jennifer Perdue to choose her target. She's going to go after the Egyptian infantry that are occupying that big central building there. Alright, cool. So she's got 2 basic choices. She can either call in Snake and Nape. That is the Mark 82 Snake Eye retarded bomb. It deploys these drag fins that slow the bomb's flight down so the plane can make a low-level strike and not blow itself up with its own blast waves, mixed with napalm, hence the term Snake and Nape. Or, again, those Rockeye CBUs. She's not taking out tanks, so she doesn't want to use the CBUs. She's going to go ahead and use the Snake and Nape on this target. Snake and Nape also has a larger blast radius. Again, it's napalm. That stuff splashes everywhere. And once those Mark 82s hit the deck, God knows, the fragmentation is going to go all over the place. However, when it comes to hitting the aim point, she misses. The bomb lands long, and the Snake and Nape actually kind of misses the infantry in that building and extends further forward along the plane's flight plan and winds up kaboom kind of in the middle of the street there. So measuring the new impact point and then the radius from that impact point, ironically, although she was using the right kind of weapons for infantry, she's now hitting armor with an infantry attack weapon. So the effects are going to be a little mixed on this last Israeli airstrike. So damage resolution on this Israeli airstrike. We wound up with a miss. It hit the BTR-60 and it hit the T-55. Okay, this is going to be kind of interesting though because we're applying kind of the wrong kind of ordnance against the wrong kind of target. But hey, we may still get some interesting results here. So the anti-tank value for Snake and Napalm is 4, and we apply it against the roof armor of these vehicles. What we're using for a roof armor value, we're kind of using a house rule here. We take whatever the flank value for the target is and subtract 2. So the BTR-60 has a roof value of 6. It doesn't matter because Jennifer rolls a 10. There goes the BTR-60, no question. T-55 is a little bit tougher though. T-55 is going to have roof armor of 10. And again, the anti-tank value is 4. So she rolls an 8, plus the 4 makes a total of 12, which, yes, is going to beat the roof armor of the T-55, which, again, we're considering a 10. So there you go. The T-55 is also smoked. The guys that we were trying to bomb were missed. Now the big question is, does that BTR-60 actually explode? If it explodes, it's going to do additional damage to nearby friendly infantry. Friendly infantry within 4 inches of an exploding AFV suffers an additional morale token. Jennifer rolls the D6, turns out it does explode, and that infantry will take another morale token. So here is where the Israelis will concede the game. I think they just wanted to get in their airstrikes before they officially quit. I don't blame them. Those airstrikes were hella expensive in their scenario build list. You paid the points for them, you might as well use them. In fact, if anything, I might have brought in those airstrikes a little bit sooner. But if you check out part 1 of this video, you'll see where the first Israeli airstrike not only got shot down by some very, very fortunate Egyptian die rolling, but shot down even before it could release its ordnance. And when that happened, I don't think the Israeli players quite realized just how lucky the Egyptian air defense rolls were, and therefore how unlikely it was that it was going to happen again. Therefore, they were a little timid about bringing in their other 2 airstrikes. Brought in a couple of turns earlier, they really could have wiped out a lot of the Egyptian tanks that would do so much damage to the Israelis in later turns of the game. Conversely, Egyptian artillery, oh my god. To be fair, it was totally well played by the Egyptian player. They picked out the right targets with the right spotting units. There's also some hella die rolling though, so hey, well done there. Alright folks, there you have it. The Israeli airstrikes did come in as promised at the end there. Made a hell of a mess as promised. They took out plenty of Egyptian armor, especially those IS-3s down to the south. But at the end of the day, too little too late. They just didn't do quite enough damage to swing the overall tide of the game, and this is going down as an Egyptian victory. Honestly, I think by the time those Israeli airstrikes came in, Egyptian tanks, and yes, their infantry, but definitely their artillery, did just too much damage, and the Israeli tanks and infantry on the table just couldn't recover. I will say, definitely a great job by all the players involved. Out of the 5 players I had on the table, only 2 had ever played 7 Days to the River Rhine before, and even those 2 players had only played it once. So this is pretty much a learning game for everyone there. I think everyone did a really great job. This is also the first time we used the house rules for airstrikes and offboard artillery missions. Honestly, I think they might be a skosh overpowered at the moment, so I'm going to be tweaking those. Keep an eye on this space to see how we develop these ideas going forward. But that's going to wrap us up for another episode here, guys. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. Also consider checking out our Discord. There is an auto-accept invite in the description of this video, so check it out and see what the rest of the community is up to. But for now, we are rounds complete for another episode. This is Ariskini Jim with the Sitrep Podcast signing off, and as always, Tango Mike for watching.